A business like TLDR should be advocating for as many elections as possible. I mean, look how our viewership leaped around last year's presidential elections. However, just because it's good for pundits and the media industry, doesn't mean that elections are always a good thing for democracy. So in this video, we're going to be asking whether America has too many elections, and if the frequency of American elections might be partially responsible for some of the more undesirable features of its politics. If you follow American elections, and given that you're watching this video, chances are you do, you might have noticed that it almost always feels like we're in campaign mode. In other democracies around the world, things usually calm down a bit between elections. In fact, they usually get, well, pretty boring. Stuff like party conferences, budgets, and speeches about hedgehogs, with the occasional by-election if you're lucky. This doesn't seem to happen so much in America. The presidential election seems like it only just happened yesterday, but already most politicians and the media are focused on the upcoming midterm elections. Every political event, whether it be Biden's poll slump, the recent uptick in inflation, or the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, is considered extra important because of its potential impact on the midterms. Both sides are apparently constantly in campaign mode, and they spend all of their energy attacking each other, trying to persuade the public there's absolutely no way they could vote for them, and bipartisanship feels distinctively out of fashion. Now, there are obviously loads of reasons for this. The ridiculous sums of money involved, political polarization of the American electorate, and the chaotic media landscape probably don't help. But one contributing factor might be that America just has too many elections. Now, when you say it out loud, it does sound crazy. How can a democracy have too many elections? Surely more elections make the political class more responsive to voters' concerns and better guarantee accurate representation in Congress. Well, yes and no. Obviously, democracies are defined by elections. That's what makes them democracies. But all democratic systems make the trade-off between representation, i.e. how accurately the government reflects the will of its electorate, and strength of governance, i.e. how able the government is to govern effectively. This balance between representation and strength of governance will always be a factor of three things. The electoral system, first past the post for example, gives more weight to the strength of governance at the expense of representation. The power of the executive, with more powerful executives usually less representative but more able to deliver strong governance, and the frequency of elections. In general, more frequent elections provide for more accurate representation, but less effective governance. This is because overly frequent elections, and the short terms that go with them, encourage bad policy and discourage bipartisanship. Let's start with bad policy. Short terms incentivize governments to implement policies with short-term benefits, even if they've got long-term costs attached. For example, governments serving in short terms might well be incentivized to rack up massive debts to help them win re-election, leaving those debts to someone else further down the line. Short terms also discourage good political risk-taking. Politicians are encouraged to play it safe to avoid being immediately punished by the electorate for anything that goes wrong, even if that risk is worth taking in the long term. Short terms also discourage bipartisanship, because elections are won by proving that your party is better than the other party, and that's often done by attacking the opposition. Regular elections encourage politicians to be constantly at each other's throats, which makes bipartisanship difficult. This is why most democracies have major elections every 4 or 5 years. It's widely considered the sweet spot for balancing quality of governance against representation. The US, on the other hand, has major elections every 2 years. And this was actually a hot topic of debate amongst the founding fathers. When the Constitution was being drafted, James Madison originally proposed a 3-year term, arguing that annual elections produced too much quote, instability in the states. At the time, however, most states had annual elections, and they liked it that way. So when Madison's 3-year terms failed to gain unanimous approval, he compromised on a 2-year term. Considering that new administrations almost always lose in the midterms, since 1934 this has happened in all but 2 elections, and campaigning for the midterm starts basically a year beforehand, US administrations have had the first year to get through the big policies, and then, well, that's it. Once the midterms are on the horizon, any chance of bipartisanship shuts down, and even incumbent politicians become wary of committing to big policies. Also, the fact that new administrations always lose in the midterms proves that the midterms aren't actually good indicators of governance. It can't be that every administration is just bad at governing. It's probably more that good governance and good policies in a country of 330 million people take time to come into effect. So voters go into the midterms thinking, what good has the new administration done for me? And end up taking away the administration's majority and basically guarantee that nothing will get done for the next 2 years. Anyway, you get the point. America has elections twice as often as everyone else does, and there's an argument to be made here that it makes the quality of their government worse. Now, you might be thinking, it can't be the 2-year terms. America has had those since the 18th century, and it's had pretty good government for most of that time. Well, you'd be right, but two things have exacerbated the 2-year term problem. Firstly, primaries. Primaries can happen 6 months before the midterms, which means even more elections and even less bipartisanship. This is because the electorate in primaries is usually dominated by party members, who typically don't reward bipartisan efforts. In other words, Republican and Democrat Party members don't really like it when their party's politicians hang out with the other side. Again, primaries are a uniquely American thing. In most other developed democracies, party members have much less say over their party's candidates. The second issue, though, is money. For those of you who don't know, since 2010 there have been basically no limits on political spending in the US. In 2002, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, otherwise known as McCain-Feingold, essentially placed limits on the amount of money that political parties could spend on campaigning. 8 years later, though, in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court overruled McCain-Feingold, arguing that limits on so-called soft money, i.e. money spent by unaffiliated corporations on political campaigns, violated the First Amendment. Following Citizens United, a DC Circuit Court cleared the way for super PACs, which allowed individuals and corporations to make unlimited amounts of contributions, as long as they weren't directly working with the campaigns and political parties. These court rulings have allowed truly silly amounts of money into American politics, which is why a staggering $14.4 billion was spent on the 2020 presidential election. For context, the UK currently has a £19.5 million campaign spending limit for most parties heading into the general election. American political spending has therefore exacerbated the two-term problem, because it allows for longer and longer campaigns. Flashy political campaigns cost money, so the more money you have, the earlier you can afford to start campaigning. JFK announced his candidacy for presidency on January 2nd, just 10 months prior to the election. Nowadays, it's not uncommon for political campaigns to begin 2 or 3 years before election time. I mean, we're already seeing articles about how Kamala Harris's falling polling ratings are hurting her 2024 chances. As we mentioned earlier, campaigns are bad because they encourage politicians to attack one another, which decreases the chances of bipartisanship and discourages good political risk-taking. Because even if the risk was worth taking at the time, politicians know they're going to start seeing attack ads about it when anything goes wrong. So that's the video. Essentially, there's an argument that America's 2-year terms are just too short, and the problem might have been exacerbated by the primary system and the silly amount of money involved in US politics. But what do you think? Are 2-year terms just more democratic? Or should we instead be focused on campaign finance reform? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when we release more videos like this one. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.